I can't see why the borders are still closed, but as I said, that's for the states and territories themselves to decide.
A Sydney private school closed after a student tests positive for COVID-19 days before face-to-face lessons resume in the public system. Millions of people in India and Bangladesh in the path of a massive cyclone expected to hit this evening. And the New Zealand Warriors set up camp in New South Wales after quarantine, with the NRL competition due to resume next Thursday. Hello and welcome to ABC News. I'm Kirsten Aiken. States and territories are coming under increasing pressure to reopen their borders, with the Deputy Chief Medical Officer saying there's no health reason to keep them closed. The Prime Minister had hoped Australians could travel interstate by July, but it's now looking unlikely. Political reporter Jane Norman joins us now. Good afternoon to you, Jane. The big question, when are the interstate borders likely to reopen?
Well, Kirsten, it certainly doesn't look at this stage that it's likely before July. In fact, it could be many, many months to come. As our viewers would be aware, at the height of the crisis, every state and territory except for the ACT, New South Wales and Victoria either closed their borders to non-residents or forced travellers to self-quarantine for 14 days. Obviously, it was a measure that they believed was necessary to stop the transmission of COVID-19 into their states or territories. But now that the numbers are so low, now that community transmission has been proven to also be so low, there is growing pressure for those states and territories to reopen their borders and allow interstate travel to happen. We know that there is certainly pressure coming from the federal government. The tourism minister said only a few days ago that those states and territories that choose to keep their borders closed will need to answer to the tourism sector and even possibly look at propping up operators who will suffer because they'll lose that interstate traffic. But states like Queensland and Western Australia are holding firm. Queensland's Premier has said that while the big states like Victoria and New South Wales still have outbreaks, little pockets of community transmission, well, she doesn't believe the Queensland borders will reopen. Western Australia's Premier Mark McGowan has taken a slightly more assertive approach, saying that he will not be bullied by his eastern states counterparts. He's also made the point that by creating somewhat of an island of Western Australia, he is able to ease restrictions more quickly than other states because they feel safe to do so. So this is shaping up as one of the more contentious remaining issues of the National Cabinet. We know that the nation's leaders have agreed to a three-stage process to ease restrictions, but this is one that doesn't have any clear ending. But as far as the health advice goes, well, the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, Paul Kelly, has confirmed that the states and territories who chose to close their borders did not do so on any health advice provided to National Cabinet. Here's what he had to say.
From a medical point of view, I can't see why the borders are still closed, but as I said, that's for the states and territories themselves to decide when that timing is right for them.
And Jane, Australia's trade dispute is deepening with China, but Labor says Australia needs to be asking some questions of the United States.
Yeah, it appears, Kirsten, that we're really being squeezed right now between our biggest trading partner, China, and our closest security ally, the United States. Now, the relationship between Canberra and Beijing has certainly been worsening this week. China slapped crippling tariffs on Australia's barley imports, basically ending what was $1 billion market back in 2018 before the drought hit. They've already banned beef imports from some Queensland abattoirs, and there really is a fear that this could be the beginning of a much bigger trade war, although you won't hear those words being used by the Australian government. But it turns out that the barley imports that China had ordered from China could be filled by US grain growers. Now, you might remember that the United States and China was locked in a bitter trade war for about 18 months until they reached a conclusion of sorts late last year, and under that deal, China agreed to take about $40 billion worth of agricultural produce from the United States. So now that China isn't taking Australian barley, it's highly likely that it might take US barley, and that might not be the only import that they'll be sort of filling the vacuum of. So Penny Wong, Labor's Foreign Affairs spokeswoman, says that Australia needs to be questioning the United States about the nature of this deal that they have done with Beijing. Here's what she had to say.
There has been an agreement between President Xi and President Trump, which involves $40 billion worth of US agricultural product being bought by China. I think it is important that we ensure that that deal doesn't disadvantage Australia.
And that's the Shadow Foreign Affairs spokeswoman, Penny Wong there, basically telling the government to ask the United States if Australia is going to be the big loser out of that trade deal done between Donald Trump and Xi Jinping last year.
Jane Norman wrapping up developments in Canberra. New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian says the state will be open for business from June the 1st, with residents allowed to go on holiday across the state. Libraries, museums and galleries will also be opening their doors. Reporter Ashley Raper has more.
We can now holiday in New South Wales from June 1, and that is in time for the Queen's birthday long weekend, which takes place at the beginning of June. Now, travel has been banned in New South Wales since March, and really for the government, this is an economic decision. They really want to boost tourism and the flow-on effects from that in terms of jobs in the tourism sector, but also in cafes and restaurant and those flow-on jobs. And they're really urging people to travel to the coastal regions, especially the South Coast, which lost its tourism dollar during the bushfires, also North Coast, South Coast, and also they're saying that we will have a ski season here in New South Wales. But the details around that are still being worked out in terms of how to work with social distancing in resorts, in the rooms where you hang your boots up, and so they will be finalised and may not be in place by June 1. But they're also encouraging interstate travellers. The Premier Gladys Berejiklian is saying very clearly you should come to Sydney from other states to have a holiday. Obviously, most other states, other than Victoria, have their borders closed. But here is what the Premier Gladys Berejiklian said about our restrictions easing today.
We're pleased to say that from 1 June there'll be no travel restrictions in New South Wales. You can go on a holiday with your family or your friends, but please also know that the holiday you'll be taking from 1 June in the COVID-safe environment will be different from a holiday you've taken before. Please take extra care in planning ahead, booking online, and making sure that you keep away from large crowds.
And so how is this news being received in the state's tourist hotspots?
It appears to be going down well. Businesses are hurting in those areas, but there also is a bit of concern because, interestingly, Gladys Berejiklian just 10 days ago said it was too risky to ease travel restrictions, but she's pointed to our cases in New South Wales continue to be low. Even just today there were 4 new cases and they all came from overseas. So Gladys Berejiklian says she now feels confident to allow travel in regional areas and that won't contribute to a big spread of the virus. But in terms of the South Coast, a mayor spoke down there and they said they're very welcome to have people back to that area.
There have also been some businesses that have, continued to trade and that have done very well. So that's a really good thing. But, obviously it has been very difficult for a large number of businesses. So, look, I can't wait for them to be able to open their doors again and to start to trade, especially around the tourism industry.
So yes, Kirsten, there will be a lot of happy tourism operators, especially along the coast and inland too in New South Wales today.
Western Australia's Premier Mark McGowan has resisted calls to lift the state's border closure. Frances Bell has more from Perth.
This border closure in WA has been in place for more than 6 weeks now, and no travellers are allowed to enter WA under this arrangement unless they have an exemption. And any West Australians leaving the state are required to undergo 14 days of compulsory quarantine upon their return. Now, as you heard a little bit earlier, there is pressure from particularly New South Wales and other federal politicians for some of those hard border closures around Australia to be lifted to try to help kickstart the economy economy, with lots of businesses hurting with the inability for people to travel for several weeks now. The West Australian Premier is having none of it. He has already said that he doesn't give a damn if the WA hard border closure inconveniences people in other states. He says he would like to see far lower rates of infection and community spread in states like New South Wales and Victoria before he would even consider lifting that border closure. And he says that the border closure will be in place for several months. And he said today that he won't be bullied by people like the New South Wales Premier, in his words. And here's a bit more of what he had to say.
It actually supports our economy to have the border with the east. It actually allows us to free up more activity within Western Australia by having the border with the east. Have a look at those states. New South Wales has barely got its schools open. Well, they got 30% attendance. They got 10% of people in restaurants and cafes. The Premier over there is saying don't catch a bus or a train. Yet they're saying people from New South Wales should fly here. No thanks.
Now, Francis, intrastate border restrictions currently remain in place. When will they be eased?
Well, they have been eased slightly already, Kirsten. As of Monday, the 13 regions in WA have been collapsed down into 4. So, for example, that means that people in Perth can now travel down to the Great Southern, to the southwest, places like Margaret River, and to the Wheat Belt, and people from those regions can come to Perth as well. But there are still restrictions in place. As I said, there's still 4 regions in place, and there is pressure on the government to ease those restrictions further, particularly from business operators in the north of the state, who would usually be enjoying a bumper tourist season at this time of year, where people from Perth flee north to the warmer winter temperatures. There is no ability for that travel to take place under these restrictions at the moment. So the government is under pressure to ease those restrictions further. The government said today, though, that it is still holding firm. It says the easing of the restrictions as they are now has only been in place for 3 days, and it would like to see how that plays out for at least a couple of weeks to ensure that there hasn't been any further spread of the virus by relaxing those restrictions. And
what are the latest case numbers in WA?
Well, the latest update, Kirsten, is that there are again no new cases here in WA, and there now remain only 3 active cases in the state with no patients in hospital.
A prestigious Sydney boarding school has been shut after a student tested positive for COVID-19. It comes ahead of the statewide reopening of schools in New South Wales next week. Bindi Bryce reports.
The gates are closed here at St Ignatius College on Sydney's lower North Shore after a student here tested positive to coronavirus. This is one of Sydney's most prestigious Catholic boys boarding schools, and we know that the student who has coronavirus is a Year 12 student, and they are one of the day students, not one of the boarding students. But apart from that, we don't know too much about this case. We have seen over the past half an hour here at the school, a lot of the parents have been driving in to pick up some of their students. There's not been too much movement here because most of the school is still learning remotely at the moment. Some of the questions that will be asked about this case are whether the student had close contact with some of the other students or the staff here at the school. We have asked New South Wales Health for some more details about this coronavirus case, and they've indicated that they will provide that in the next 24 hours or so. And this case here at St Ignatius College comes as Gladys Berejiklian, the New South Wales Premier, said earlier in the week that all students across the state will be going back to school full-time as of next week. So this case here in Sydney might come as a concern to some parents.
Victorian public health officials have begun using the new COVID Safe app to help find close contacts of a person who has tested positive. In a first for the state, Victorian health authorities identified a COVID-19 positive patient on Monday who had the COVID Safe app registered on their phone. The patient gave consent to health authorities to use the data, which has been downloaded to look for potential contacts.
We have had one case who had the app downloaded, who agreed to release the data from the app, and that we downloaded the data from the app, and that revealed one close contact who hadn't been identified in the initial interviewing process. So that's good news, and that person has been contacted and placed into quarantine.
A Brisbane woman in her 70s has tested positive to coronavirus 2 months after travelling from overseas. The single case overnight brings Queensland's total to 1,058. 12 of those are active cases, including 4 patients in hospital, one of whom is in ICU. The state's Chief Health Officer, Dr Jeanette Young, says in the latest case, the woman only recently developed mild respiratory symptoms after returning from India via Singapore.
At this stage, we're not sure whether that is a persistent case or whether she's acquired it here. We think it most likely that she acquired the case in India, but we'll now have to do a lot of work to work through that, some additional testing, and also we'll have to talk to her and look at contact tracing. So all that work has started.
A Senate inquiry into domestic and family violence, set up days after a Brisbane mother and her 3 children were burned to death, has wrapped up 3 months early. It didn't take submissions or hold public hearings. The committee chair, Labor Senator Kim Carr, says they would have been of limited benefit given the coronavirus pandemic. Karen Walsh runs the Brisbane Domestic Violence Service at Micah Projects and joins me now. Good afternoon to you. Is Senator Carr right? Is it too hard to hold an inquiry such as this one during a coronavirus pandemic?
Oh, well, I wouldn't agree that it is. I think that any Senate inquiry is part of our parliament and part of ensuring that, you know, our democracy is alive and well, and that anyone who can contribute to an inquiry as important as this domestic violence inquiry is, you know, could have easily have been asked to contribute either through written submissions, or many people have come up with some great innovative ways to have social media platforms, Zoom platforms or whatever, WebEx, to actually contribute and give some information to something as important as this. I think that there certainly could have been the opportunity. I'm not sure why it was chosen not to have that opportunity.
What had you hoped would be achieved from this inquiry?
Well, I think with any inquiry into something as significant as domestic violence, you want all your stakeholders to be able to have a contribution to it. So family members, citizens who have been directly impacted on the loss of a loved one, stakeholders, services, other jurisdictions. This was a national inquiry. However, in the process, I think, was lacking, but there are some things in the report that I think would give indication that once we're through COVID, it would be really important to build on this paper and build on this, because, you know, the evidence has indicated that whilst there's been some decrease around violence against women, the evidence is really clear that with intimate partner violence, it hasn't decreased, and coercive control, and, you know, resulting in the deaths of women. So there's a lot of work to continue. The report has given some indicators about attitudinal changes, and that we really need to continue to focus on what is the dynamics of intimate partner violence and coercive control, because these are the this is what's leading to the deaths of women, and what so many women are living in fear and are injured every day across Australia.
And so is the decision to wind up this inquiry early all the more surprising to you because of the Prime Minister and opposition leaders' statements to Parliament shortly after Hannah Clark and her children were killed at the hands of her estranged partner, saying that lessons needed to be learned?
Look, it is surprising. I have absolutely no understanding or information about why the Senate inquiry did this, and I think that it certainly means that we're probably going to have more inquiries. But, you know, they did review some things from the National Action Plan and where we're going to the future action plan, but it's more a review than it is an inquiry. It's not a comprehensive look at the things that we need to continue to be looking at, so that we can understand why domestic violence is, you know, we're not making any grounds in terms of the extent of intimate partner violence, which, you know, we all know is to do with attitudes towards gender inequality, how our institutions acknowledge that, how we understand the dynamics of coercive control. It's these things require much more education, attention, so that we can get the system functioning right.
And so Senator Carr said that would be of limited value at this time to fulfil the 6-month inquiry. Let's speak about right now. What is happening in Brisbane at the moment under COVID-19, given that families are in much closer quarters at the moment, having been forced home from school and some workplaces? Is the Brisbane Domestic Violence Service seeing an increase in calls for help?
We're seeing a difference in our calls. People are not able to call because they're constantly with the partner or the intimate partner who's using violence. So the opportunity to call is often shorter, more frequently, thinking about safety planning. I do think COVID has all the factors that you need for coercive control to thrive. So women are in positions where they're experiencing more control and more we've certainly seen women that it's continued where they need to escape because of injury and harm, where they're hospitalised, where they need to get emergency accommodation. But, generally across the board in terms of whether women can actually ring us is an issue. Like, we know that the Senate inquiry did identify that women's help-seeking behaviour has increased, and I think that we have seen evidence of that after Hannah and her children died. And during COVID, we've seen people still reach out, but not at the same level, because we had a huge increase of phone calls after Hannah and her children's death, and there's been a decrease in comparison to that. But there's still been a consistent flow of people seeking services. There's a lot of women seeking emotional support for thinking, how long is this going to take and when will be the safest time for them to leave. Often we see during school holidays a decrease in calls because, they've got the children at home, and women are very, busy with activities around children, and it's not the right time to be planning. Or for others, it might be the perfect time. There's no one sort of scenario to describe it. But we do know that the COVID virus and the stay at home has meant that women do not have the opportunity to seek the support and the services they need. They also have other people, there's other people around, to what extent they can reach out. In some cases, they may have been able to reach out because more people were at home and near them. But generally speaking, women's ability to seek help has been compromised by being with their partner all the time and his control
Karen,
over what they do.
Karen Walsh, thank you for taking the time to talk to us today.
Thank you.
And if this story has raised any issues for you, you can get help by calling the National Sexual Assault and Family Violence Counselling Helpline, 1800-RESPECT. That number is 1800 737732. An international study has found that carbon emissions fell by 17% a day in April as a result of the coronavirus lockdowns around the world. The fall in Australia has been even higher, down by as much as 28%. Dr Pep Canadell from the CSIRO is also the Executive Director of the Global Carbon Project, which ran the numbers here in Australia. He says there is an opportunity to make the improvement permanent as we start to move out of lockdown.
The level has no precedent in our history, recorded history of kind of modern fossil society. We would need to go back to the Second World War to find a period where there were a similar relative drop, but in absolute value, we've never seen anything like that. It came very quickly. As quickly it came, of course, the confinement rules that got deployed very quickly all across the world. We did an incredible good job at confinement, and it was a very high level confinement, and it was all rolled out all across the all the states and territories. And actually, it was really interesting that another country who really was very hard and high level in the confinement levels and the length of it was New Zealand, which even had a higher drop in emissions than us at almost 40%. China, of course, had the drop earlier. It saw quite a bit of a drop, about a little less than actually what we've seen in Australia, about 26%. There was a lot of manufacturing that kept going in China. So yeah, it happened. It happened earlier, and then all combined, we've seen the first 3 months in about an 8% drop. I want to say that actually here that one of the big surprises we got, it was not as much as the fact that we were dropping very quickly and a lot, but the fact that we shut down a good part, and in some instances, the entire economy of dozens and dozens of countries, and we still are emitting more than 80% of the total emissions, just showing us, how much the energy consumption and production is embedded into our, fabric of society and economy, and so hard to actually stop it. But globally, we've seen that the surface transport, and particularly road transport, was the most important. Almost half of it, of the drop, was because the reduced road transport. The second was about the generation of electricity, power, and the third, industry. Air was relatively small, but actually it's interesting that when we look at specifically the data for Australia, the most important is transport, second power, but the third is aviation, just showing how important for us the whole mobility and how much shapes the profile of CO2 emissions in Australia. We don't know how the economy is going to develop. We don't know how the pandemic is going to develop, but we have actually somehow constrained, the range that is possible. And we think that by the end of the year, we'll have a diminished emissions anywhere between 4 and 7%. That's extraordinary as well. We don't have records in the modern history of such a massive drop. Now, what happens after it is all about what the economy is going to do. And we know that for the global financial crisis in 2008, it took a whole 10 years, a whole decade to actually fully recover globally. So I think that we're likely to see, of course, a slower economy growth, and that emissions will follow suit, which means that we may see also a slower emission growth for a number of years. Now, what can we lock here? I think that we're very excited to see the data coming from mobility. So we've done a lot of good work in many parts of the world, in Australia, in greening the electricity production through renewable energy, solar and wind. But we haven't done much on transport. And the numbers shows how important transport could be if we use it as a mitigation option, that is moving to electrification of the mobility, moving into more active mobility in the big cities, that is, walking, biking, scooting. There's a lot of provision now being made in big cities to actually avoid some of the mass transportation as confinement is lifted. And a lot of cities are calling for perhaps maintain those new capacity for active mobility to become a permanent feature of the cities, which will be a win-win for the climate, for sustainability, and of course, for pollution and health for people.
Time to check the weather now with Graham Creed. And Graham, what is the latest on that massive cyclone in the Bay of Bengal?
It's still a very significant system. The radar has the eye sitting just off the coast of West Bengal at the moment. It is continuing to move in a north to northeasterly direction, and anywhere near the centre of the cyclone eye is likely to see the potential of wind gusts to around 180 to 200 kilometres per hour. So still seeing significant winds. Storm surge is going to be a major issue with this system, particularly around the delta areas, around Bangladesh and the West Bengal region, and that system is continuing to move towards the coast at the moment. Now, it's not the only tropical system impacting that region of the globe at the moment. If we cross over the equator into the southern hemisphere, we've got a tropical low that could potentially form into a cyclone. Even if it doesn't, it is going to bring some windy and wet weather to the Cocos Islands. And then as we move into the weekend, it'll actually start to move towards Western Australia, and this could lead to some very wet conditions developing by the end of the weekend and early next week. And we can see a massive cloud that's been feeding in from thunderstorms around Indonesia that's been drawn in along the jet stream. Now, most of this cloud will push in a more northerly direction over the next day or two. It's a very different story through the southeast, though. This frontal system is bringing the potential of very cold, wet and windy conditions. We are going to see snow returning to the alpine areas of New South Wales and Victoria and also across Tasmania. And then once that frontal system actually moves out off the coast of New South Wales, we're expecting a low pressure system to form overnight Thursday and into Friday. But during tomorrow, we'll see those cold, wet and windy conditions spreading through South Australia, Victoria, Tasmania and New South Wales as that front progresses east. We still see some patchy rain and thunderstorms through Queensland and the Northern Territory into the far northern parts of the Kimberley in Western Australia. And as that front moves off the coast, a low pressure system will form somewhere along the coast or off the coast of Sydney to the Illawarra. And that's going to start to see some rain developing for Sydney and the Illawarra region. We'll also start to see winds strengthening in association with that. So a much cooler day on the way for Sydney after tops today of around about 24 degrees. We've got cold, wet and windy conditions across the southeast, although conditions will clear quite quickly through South Australia into Victoria and Tasmania. And this is due to a high pressure system ridging through. There's still plenty of showers and some areas of rain through Queensland, but it's into Friday that we see the most dangerous of the conditions. Is when we see very wet conditions through New South Wales, quite windy, particularly along the coast, and we see much colder temperatures as well.
You can keep up to date at news.abc.net.au and on iView. Here are the top stories on ABC News this afternoon. The Deputy Chief Medical Officer has weighed in on the debate over state border closures, saying he doesn't think they're needed. New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian is calling for interstate visits to resume and has called on other states to relax their travel restrictions. Professor Paul Kelly says in his view there's no medical reason for internal borders to stay shut. A student at St Ignatius College, Riverview in Sydney has tested positive for COVID-19. Students and staff have been sent home or confined to dormitories and contact tracing is underway. Face-to-face learning in New South Wales is due to resume full-time next Monday. Australian researchers are preparing to trial an anti-malaria drug on health workers. Hydroxychloroquine has been touted as a possible prevention or treatment for COVID-19, but there are also warnings it can be dangerous. Researchers from Melbourne's Walter and Eliza Hall Institute hope to sign up 2,250 hospital and health workers across the country for the trial. And the New Zealand Warriors are setting up their new home base on the New South Wales Central Coast today after quarantining in Tamworth. The NRL team's players and staff had been in isolation for 14 days but were allowed to train together during that time. The season is due to restart late next week. Now, Graham touched on it a short time ago. Heavy rains and winds are lashing to eastern Indian states and parts of Bangladesh as Cyclone Umphoon approaches landfall tonight. Rescue teams are evacuating millions of villagers to higher ground in an operation complicated by the coronavirus pandemic. Bangladesh's disaster management officials say they're working on a war footing to evacuate 2 million people from coastal areas. Walter Mwasa is the Country Director for Care in Bangladesh and he joins me now. Thank you very much for your time. What information do you have about the cyclone's early impacts?
Thank you and good evening. We are obviously kind of, in a sense, breathing a little sigh of relief. The path has kind of shifted a little and the projected impact is going to be a little less. Nonetheless, as you said, there is 2 million that are being currently moved. The effect of the cyclone is going to be heavy on the farm lands that are kind of pre-harvest season right now. We are also concerned about the salinity that the storm surges usually brings onto the farmlands themselves and the issues of drinking water. as you said, with the COVID-19 situation, the complications on moving people into shelters and trying to maintain social distancing is a big concern for us.
And so just try to talk us through how you were able to evacuate such a large number of people given what we're facing with the pandemic.
So the way this works is the government here has what is called a cyclone preparedness program, which works with community level volunteers, and each community has access to a predefined shelter location. And so when this happens, as early as 3 days ago, they'd already started preparing people for the movement. They did start with the elderly, the women, the children, and later the men would be going in. So the way it's done, it's structured, and it kind of helps with that movement, making sure the most vulnerable are out first, and they start to get into the shelters prior to the others. So with the space availability, which we believe is sufficient for now, we think we should be able to get everyone in without necessarily overcrowding the paths or the entrances to these shelters.
But what do you know about the presence of the coronavirus infection among those people who have been forced to leave their homes? We know that coronavirus has now been confirmed in some Rohingya refugees who have had to move.
Yeah. So maybe I'll come back to the Rohingya refugee situation, but with the specific area, which is the southwest. So the southwest part is where Bangladesh is going to get hit. Because of the shift, the impact is going to be much less for the country, and will cover mostly 3 southwestern districts are the ones we are concerned about. Previously, it was projected to hit right in the middle of the southern part of the country, so pretty much spreading across the entire country. So with the refugee situation, we don't expect much. There's been some wins reported. We are obviously working through ways of making sure people are aware it's coming, but we do not expect any significant damage or need to move, at least from the camps. For the rest of the community in the southwest zone, it's really racing to get all these people in, keeping them safe from each other and also from potential infections. Now, one of the districts, Khulna, has kind of been the one that has seen infections, not high as we've seen in Dhaka. Close to 50% of the cases in Bangladesh are in Dhaka and a few other cities. So the villagers and the rural communities haven't really begun to witness this, so we don't expect a significant impact on this one for the COVID infections.
And given the impact that you're expecting in the Delta, I suppose that is going to have quite a long-term impact on the area's food production. What do you know about past cyclones, how long the effects tend to last?
Well, we're still dealing with salinity, and especially that's a big area, that big concern in that area. So the moment the surge waters come in and they inundate the farmlands, it takes years to get rid of that. And the salinity is a big problem for the farmers and the low-income earners that need to find ways to desalinate or find other income opportunities. So what we are looking at is right now, the government has been trying to repair any of the breaches on the protection walls that have been built from previous experiences. If we get away with it, we continue to work on restoring people's livelihoods, which would be the crops that may be lost, animals, but also looking at alternatives to their incomes. Looking at in the recent past.
We just lost your audio there for a moment. Walter Mwasa, it's been terrific to have you talk to us. All the best with the response to that emerging natural disaster.
Thank you.
Back home, and tourism operators across New South Wales are preparing for an influx of travellers within weeks. The Premier, Gladys Berejiklian, has confirmed the state will lift limits on regional travel from June. The announcement has come as relief to struggling businesses in places like the Shoalhaven. The South Coast region has been hit hard by the twin disasters of the bushfires and then the coronavirus shutdown.
It's a glimmer of hope, really, and it's a positive step in the right direction. Of course, we've got to be aware of the social restrictions and follow the government guidelines. Dolphin Watch Cruises plans to reopen on the 1st of June, which is exciting. It's the cusp of the whale season, and I'm sure the staff will be welcoming the visitors back to the South Coast.
I think people are still a bit unsure and they're not committing to bookings. So no one really knows what is going to happen. So if an outbreak comes, then it might have to be shut down again. So no one's really confident that it might be a sure thing. But in terms of the restaurant, yeah, to have at least 50 people in the restaurant would be great. But finding the staff is the next thing.
The first Australian trial to see whether the drug hydroxychloroquine can prevent COVID-19 has begun recruiting volunteers. The trial is looking for healthcare professionals with the hope of reducing outbreaks of the virus among hospital staff. Professor Monica Slavin is an infectious diseases specialist at the Royal Melbourne Hospital and is involved in logistics for the trial. She says there is some encouraging preliminary data.
Our staff are really very interested in the research questions often and like to participate in trials, and also knowing that this trial, if it's successful, could show some benefit for other healthcare workers and other people exposed to the virus. So I think there is quite a bit of interest already in participating in the trial.
Take us through what the trial involves and how long half of the participants will be required to take hydroxychloroquine.
Yes, so it's a 4-month period on the hydroxychloroquine, although people can stop earlier, of course, if they have any side effects or if there is a reason why they need to stop. And during the trial, people will be screened to make sure they don't have any conditions that means they couldn't take the drug. And then they'll be consented and explain the whole ins and outs of the trial. Then they'll provide consent, and at that point, we will start monitoring them for any symptoms and also do a screening test for a cardiograph before they go onto the trial. So they'll be having close follow-up, they'll be keeping a diary of any symptoms, and we'll be looking at that day by day while they're on the trial.
You mentioned that there has been a lot of interest in this particular medication. Has it already been written off in overseas trials?
I think that's an interesting question because the trials done overseas have been of varying quality, and they've really been looking at treating the infection once it's established. And so we've seen it used in mild cases, we've seen it used in severe cases, often in small numbers and in low quality trials. So we don't really have a good feeling for what the outcome is going to be, but we're taking it one step earlier and we're giving it to people as a preventative. And we know from other drugs that they're often more successful in preventing an infection than once you've got the full-blown infection that you need to treat. So that's the logic behind it. Even though there are some studies that are not very impressive about this drug in treatment of full-blown infection, we're actually looking at it in a completely different scenario.
What do you make of Donald Trump's admission that he's taking it as a precaution?
Yeah, interesting. I think that, there's no data yet. We don't know. There are trials being designed around the world to look at it as a preventative. We're not the only one. But I think, there is nothing to say that yet it's going to be successful. So I think it's a bit premature to go out and jump on this drug before we've got the scientific evidence to back it up.
And so what is it about this drug that Australian researchers believe it might just work as a treatment?
Yeah, I think it's encouraging from some of the data that we've got from test tube studies showing how it can actually improve people's immune responses against the drug and how it can actually block the drug from entering into the lungs of block the virus from entering into the lungs of the person who's been exposed. So there is some very encouraging preliminary data from laboratories, but we really need to see how it works in real life.
The federal government is warning there's been an increase of cyber attacks on hospitals and medical facilities around the globe. Australia's ambassador for cyber affairs says malicious cyber actors are trying to exploit the pandemic for their own gain. But the government hasn't named which countries or criminal organisations it believes are behind the attacks and says there's no evidence at this stage of hospitals being targeted here in Australia. Political reporter Stephen Jedjet spoke with Ambassador Tobias Aiken.
The purpose of this statement is to highlight what we're seeing in the international environment. So we haven't seen, luckily, this kind of activity here in Australia. But what we do see are incidents such as some of your viewers might remember the incidents that were reported around the Czech Republic, where they had a very direct targeting of their medical infrastructure points during April. And it led to a cascade of other countries, including US, the EU, Estonia and others, highlighting that was unacceptable. We have bodies such as the United Nations, which have agreed acceptable norms of state behaviour, and that outlines the fact that certainly to impair or damage critical infrastructure that's used for delivering public services, and it's hard to think of any public service that's more critical than hospitals and medical facilities right now, that's essentially out of bounds. So we're reinforcing this. We're also reinforcing the fact that states have a responsibility to stop traffic, malicious traffic that might be emanating from within their borders that might be being used for this case. Again, another area in which the UN has said very clearly that's unacceptable behaviour.
So who do we believe globally are behind these attacks? Is it cyber criminals primarily, or is it state actors?
Well, look, the cyber threat environment is an incredibly complex area, and often state entities and also cyber criminals become conflated, and many states actually use that on purpose to mask their activity. So the simple answer is it's both, sometimes jointly, sometimes separately, but the idea of this statement is to highlight the fact that we are seeing this uptick in this kind of activity directed towards those kinds of facilities.
And presumably DFAT then, or the Australian government, is concerned that Australian facilities, and particularly presumably our medical research industry, could well be a very tempting target.
Absolutely, and the Australian Cybersecurity Centre on the 8th of May put out an advisory highlighting this concern so that those facilities could be on a higher state of alert and protect themselves against these kinds of activities. You know, it's really important that we are more cyber resilient as a country and that we can assist those internationally. And that's something that we do an awful lot of, is trying to assist other countries as well in making sure that they're more cyber resilient to these kinds of threats.
The billionaire retailer Solomon Lew is refusing to honour his rent agreements with landlords, which includes property giant Stockland. It owns more than 30 big shopping centres across the country, and it's now not ruling out evictions. It comes as retail data shows spending has dropped dramatically. Host of the business, Elise Morgan, joins me now. So, Elise, the battle over retail rents is really heating up.
It certainly is. Tonight on the program, we take a look at it. We look at one jeweller in a small Sydney shopping centre, not a Stockland one, who has been trying to get rent relief since the pandemic started. And we've only tonight just had news from the landlord called Malfa that they will be giving some rent relief to this tenant and backdating it from the beginning of the pandemic. So that's great news. Also, I mean, grabbing the headlines is, of course, the very colourful billionaire retailer Solomon Lew, who owns Premier Investments. It includes brands like Just Jeans, Dotti, Peter Alexander, Smiggle, etc. He's got hundreds of stores across Australia in shopping centres. As soon as the pandemic started, of course, the stores were closed. He said he wasn't paying any rent at all, which was a fairly big call for him to make. Not all of his landlords are big companies. And then he's now come back and said he won't honour the rental agreements that he's had with them. He would like to pay just 6% of turnover starting from now. One of his landlords, Stockland, has said that's not what's in the lease agreement. I spoke to the CEO, Mark Steinert, today. I said, what if all of your tenants did use the same tactic as Solomon Lew? If they all said, look, we're only going to pay a fraction of our retail, how would that go? And he doesn't believe that many other retailers would be so bold.
The conversations with the vast majority of our tenants are very sensible. They're looking at the profitability, they're looking at where their cost structures are and what we can do to help them through the crisis, and also where they want to put new stores. and we're working through that in a very constructive way. As I've said in other forums, we don't intend to go beyond the code, and I'd also reinforce that a lease is a legal obligation that's been entered into freely by two parties.
Would you kick out Premier Investments if they're going to say we're only going to pay 6%?
We're going to stand by our leases.
And we're going to be talking about this for a while, aren't we? Because data out today shows that Australians simply aren't spending like they did.
No, not at all. We saw an enormous run-up in retail spending in March. Of course, we saw that in the official data. We spoke about it at the time. That's just come screaming back down in April, and it really shows that as lockdowns were starting, everyone rushed to the shops, did that panic buying, stocked up on everything that they could possibly need for the next 2 years, and now they don't need to shop at all. And while stores and shopping centres have started to see a huge bounce in foot traffic over the last couple of days as different states have relaxed different rules, we're not spending like we were. If you look at the ABS data out today, from month to month, from March to April, sales were down an enormous 18%. That obviously reflects the big run-up that we saw. But if you compare it year on year, so April to April, which is a better way to look at it, it's down 7%. That's going to be meaningful considering that we're already seeing retail sales on the slide. There will be more specialty retailers under pressure because of this. A lot of our spending is still directed at food retailing, mostly the supermarkets, and we're continuing, of course, to see not a lot of spending in cafes and restaurants, despite a lot of them being open for takeaway, etc. They're just not doing the trade that they were. So a lot of pain still out there, and of course, very few people are going out and buying clothes and footwear, etc. We've seen a huge bounce in retailing for pyjamas, etc. Peter Alexander saw a huge bounce, as we saw in Premier Investments. So there's a lot of people sitting at home in their gym jams, but otherwise not a lot of spending across that sector. So a lot of pain out there still to come.
Okay, we'll look out for you on the business tonight. Thanks, Elise. New Zealand Warriors are setting up their new home base on the New South Wales Central Coast after quarantining in Tamworth. The players and staff will be staying in an exclusive apartment complex overlooking the beach at Terrigal. Reporter Emma Simkin was there when the team arrived.
The New Zealand Warriors have just arrived here in Terrigal on the New South Wales Central Coast. They've come down in 2 buses today from Tamworth, where they've been quarantining. The players are now just collecting their luggage and preparing to settle in to their new place of residence. This is where they're going to be staying for the duration of the NRL season. They're going to be living here at a quite luxurious apartment building, and they'll be training at Central Coast Stadium. They'll be working in a local gym, and they'll be escorted to and from all these different events to ensure that there is no contamination. They have, of course, been in quarantine since arriving in Australia, and the NRL doing everything it can to ensure that these players are kept very safe from the rest of the community. And they're now preparing to set up their accommodation, hoping at some stage that their families may be able to join them as well. But that, of course, is dependent on international travel restrictions. But for now, the players certainly will enjoy being here on the Central Coast. Good place to be, isn't it? A lot of smiles. They're certainly looking happy to be here, and will enjoy being here by the beach, but not be able to be on the beach, of course, because very tight restrictions in terms of what the players can and can't do.
Let's look at some of the day's other sports news now with Jared Coote. Hi, Jared. One of Greg Inglis's former teammates has given his thoughts on the veteran coming out of retirement.
Yeah, he has. So we're all shocked by the announcement that Greg will be heading over to the Warrington Wolves. A one-year deal starting next year over in the English Super League. Of course, he retired in April last year, so it'll be interesting to see how he goes over in England. He'll be 33 when he plays over there, so not too others. People quite a bit older than that playing in the NRL at the moment, but he is back, so it's always tougher to play over there at that level. As you see, the New Zealand Warriors, of course, doing the haka before they left their base there to head to Gosford. I don't know where social distancing went during the haka, but that's for another time. As for Greg Inglis, well, a lot of chat about him not being medically retired as well. he did leave because he had a lot of injuries. He says he couldn't play to his usual standard that he wanted, and that was because his body was holding him back. But it seems like more than a year out from the game has done him good. He's been working for the Rabbitohs in an off-field role. Dane Gagai played with him at Queensland and, of course, with the Rabbitohs as well. And he had this to say on the impact he thinks he can have over in England.
He's one of the most professional trainers. He works hard, and like I said, it's funny, you forget his age because he's been playing in the NRL for so long and at such a high level. I just don't think his body really got a chance to have a break. He was always working hard and performing at an elite level. And I think this bit of time off has given himself time to heal all those little niggly injuries. And I don't think they would have signed him and I don't think he would have signed if he didn't think he could perform.
And now to the AFL, and the 4 teams that are going to have to go into that Gold Coast hub to play are busy preparing.
Yeah, that's right. So they're still waiting for a few details, a different scenario for all 4 teams. So, of course, we know the 2 teams from South Australia, the Adelaide Crows and Port Adelaide, are now exempt from the coronavirus restrictions for training. So full contact is now allowed for them, but that will start on Monday because the AFL rules are they can't get into full contact training until Monday to make it fair for everyone else. They're still required to stay at home when they're not training. You can only leave for essential purposes. The teams now will stay in South Australia until heading to the Gold Coast a little later on. Adam Simpson, the coach of the West Coast Eagles, spoke today as well. He said he's happy with how the players came back, but they're not sure of the exact details of how many players and staff will head to the Gold Coast. But he did have this to say about the team getting into full contact training and whether they'll be ready physically.
Look, we can't go too hard. Well, I think we've got 5 contact sessions before we play. I think it'll be enough. The early indications with our group is they're really fit. They've done all the things required and in essence done another 2 months of pre-season, really. It's 3 months pre-season, play 1 game, another 2 months of training, a few tapered sessions in that, and now we ramp it up again.
So, yeah, mixed news for great that they get back to the Gold Coast and get playing, but still a few details to work through for them. And quickly on the Premier League, we know they've started to return to training in small groups with no contact. Well, all the players are being checked for coronavirus. 6 players and staff tested positive, but still looking for a return in June.
Okay, thanks, Jared.
Thank you.
Remember, you can keep up to date at news.abc.net.au and on iView. There'll be more on our top stories next with Karina Carvalho. Stay with us here on ABC News. Enjoy your evening.
Julia is back in a brand new season.
I'm a politician. Apparently they never break the law.
Apparently. Climbing into the passenger seat for a trip down memory lane.
This is amazing.
And first cab off the rank is Dr. Carl.
What were you like as a kid?
Lonely, geeky.
The man, the myth, the legend.
So was it after Papua New Guinea you turned into a little bit of a hippie?
No, I turned into a big bit of a hippie.
Julia Zamiro's Home Delivery returns tonight at 8 on ABC and iView.
Tomorrow on News Breakfast, missing overseas travel? We'll review the trip to Greece, comedians Steve Coogan and Rob Brydon's latest odyssey.
And we'll take you to Thursday Island to find out how remote Australia is dealing with the coronavirus crisis. Don't miss it.
Tomorrow, Barry talks with human rights activist and former Socceroos captain Craig Foster.
Welcome to 1+1.
On the role of sport during the pandemic.
Go and find who's in need in your community and help them.
And saving footballer Hakeem El Arabi.
This is a refugee. We need to fight for him and get him out.
1+1 tomorrow. An epic 6-part series reflecting on where we've come from and where to next.
History does not progress in a straight line. It's constantly circular.
Road to Now starts Tuesday 9:30 on ABC and iView.
For stepping up in tough times. For doing the little things. For keeping your distance. And your sense of humour. For the courage you've shown. And protecting your community. Thanks, Australia. The changes to stop the coronavirus aren't easy, but they're working. Keep going. And don't forget to download the COVID Safe app today. Together, we're stopping the spread. Authorised by the Australian Government, Canberra.
critically acclaimed series are yours to stream free on ABC iView.
Yours, me.
I am so much happier now she's dead.
Up for a game?
Kindness and love can change a man.
There might be more here than you thought.
The biggest titles are all yours. ABC iView. Yours to stream. Miriam hits the Red Centre.
Alice Springs is the lesbian capital of the world.
It's a great place to be yourself.
And goes in search of Aussie mateship.
How am I doing? Very well. Aboriginal women are forcing people to make life better. I'm Miriam Margulies, almost Australian.
Tuesday, ABC and iView.
It's all hands on deck here at Maralinga as our troops and scientists prepare for the next British atomic bomb test.
You must know the huge importance of this project to Britain and the Empire.
These things are important because we need to know what our bombs do.
Nuclear is our future.